This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to bring context and background to a big story in the news through a conversation with someone with real insight and experience. This week we're talking about policing. The distressing scenes on Clapham Common have made many question police tactics, not just there, but in policing more generally, as the COVID pandemic has created a completely new environment in which officers must work. I've been talking to John Apter, Chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales, essentially the police officers' trade union. He tells me the police have never been under more pressure, policing has never been more politicised, and he fears that his colleagues are now even seen as the villains of the pandemic. John Apter, thanks very much for joining us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Talking about policing, in the last year, we've heard a lot rightly about people on the front line of the NHS and the pressures they've been under. What about your members? What are the sort of pressures that you're hearing from them because of the last year?
It's been unprecedented, and the level of pressure has been, in some cases, intolerable. But we have to take it back to the concept of policing and what's been asked of us during this pandemic. We've been asked to police in a way that we've never been expected to police before. I mean, I've been a police officer for more than 28 years, and the way that we've been asked to police, I've been out with my colleagues policing in this environment, and it's alien. Asking people to wear masks, not to be in groups, not to be in houses together, and the protests that we've seen, shops being closed, and it's just been the most alien of situations to police, and not that any of us want to do, but it's a health crisis. It's not a police crisis. So what we've ultimately all been trying to do is keep people as safe as we can from this horrible virus.
Has it strained the relations that officers have on the ground with members of the public?
I think that's a really interesting point. You'll have heard police officers, senior police officers and people like me saying that we police by consent in this country. And that's a foundation of policing which is really, really important. The public are the police and the police are the public, and that they are values that I really do hold dear. Without doubt, the strain has been put on that relationship, and it's been put on the relationship for a number of reasons. One is, as I've already said, that what's been expected of policing is very, very different to what is normal. I think policing has really tried to explain why we're doing what we're doing, and I think the vast majority of the public are with us on that and they get it. But as time has moved on throughout this pandemic, the frustrations have most certainly built. It's almost like a pressure cooker, and we certainly saw last summer that built during some of the protests. At the same time, normal policing has to continue. So we're still dealing with the 999 calls, we're still dealing with the missing people, with the assaults, but at the same time, we're trying to police this pandemic. So the relationship's definitely been strained. And when we move out of this crisis into whatever normal looks like, we've got to make sure that we pull together that relationship, dust ourselves down, and make sure that the public know that we are there for them, as in policing.
What about the strain on your officers? Because they're obviously used to dealing with difficult situations. How is it manifesting itself with the individuals, the officers, your colleagues, in terms of, this extra dimension of, basically having to, boss the public around, and I mean, you wouldn't put it like that, I'm sure, but tell them to do things in a way that you've never had to do before?
It's been relentless. The pressure has been relentless. And look, I've said many times, of course, we're recruiting more officers at the moment, but we don't have enough officers that's expected of us, not only in the current climate, but before. So the pressure is relentless. And police officers, yes, they wear a uniform and they have a warrant card, but behind that, they are human beings. And they have the same concerns and frailties as any other member of the public. They've been concerned about this virus, about taking it home and, with their families and the risks that presents. The abuse that some of them have faced out on the on the front line has been, incredibly destructive. The violence that they face, throughout this pandemic, most levels of crime, certainly in the first half or 3/4 of the pandemic, most levels of crime dropped. No great surprise because there was fewer people about, shops and so on were closed. But the only level of crime that increased significantly was assaults on police officers and other emergency workers. And that was things like being spat at and coughed at. So it has been incredibly tough. And when we've seen in some media where the actions of police officers, and look, I'm not here to say we get everything right. Policing is, it's fast-paced, it's dynamic. We're not always going to get things right. But it's what we do with the situations we get wrong. That's what's important. But the way that sometimes it's twisted and manipulated would make you think that we're always getting things wrong. So my colleagues are telling me all the time that they often feel they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. It can be really frustrating.
Well, we'll certainly come back to some of those issues, I think. But just one more question on this. Do you or have some of your officers come to you and said, why have we not been moved up the vaccination pecking order? Just do people come to you because you were talking about they worry about taking it home to their families, for instance? Have people said that to you?
Absolutely, overwhelmingly. When it was early December, actually, when the vaccine priority list the concept was being pulled together. And look, I make this absolutely crystal clear for everyone. I've never suggested that police officers and frontline police staff should be at the front of the queue ahead of the most vulnerable or frontline colleagues from the NHS. Absolutely, that would be wrong. But there should be a place for police officers and frontline police staff within the prioritisation list because of what's expected of them. The reality of policing means they are being put in a more vulnerable place. And I know that the scientists and the JCVI, the body that looks at this, they will say it's about stopping people dying and being very seriously ill. I accept that, which is why I've said the most vulnerable should be prioritised first. But police officers are not immune from this virus. We've lost a number of police officers, tragically. Many thousands of police officers have been struck down with the virus and had to be off work. So that creates an issue of resilience for policing. So I do think there was a genuine argument for police officers to be prioritised. And with the success of this vaccine programme, and it has been a massive success, then we could have vaccinated every police officer across England and Wales and frontline police staff in a day, less than a day. I don't think it was too much to ask. And police officers do feel bitterly let down by the government not to prioritise them.
And would you say to the government now, it's not too late, look, you can change that priority list now?
Absolutely. I speak with the Home Secretary and the Policing Minister regularly, and they know my views on this, and we're not going to let it go, and it certainly won't be forgotten. I mean, what we do have are, around the country, and the Home Secretary recently has talked about this, around the country, leftover vaccines will be made available to some people, and in those lists, some police officers are receiving those leftover vaccines, but it's nowhere near enough. And also, it's almost like, please, sir, can I have some more? We should be on the prioritisation list. We're told by government that they value the work that police officers do, but then it's not followed through. So there is that real sense of anger. I'm feeling very much let down. So it's not too late. The government could act very quickly on this.
Okay, let's talk about some of the difficult issues of the last few weeks. Obviously, one of the most recent ones was the policing of the Sarah Everard Vigil on Clapham Common. Something clearly went wrong there. What was the problem? Where would you say this didn't work as it should have done?
I mean, as we speak here and now, there is an inquiry into the events of that vigil and the policing of it from Her Majesty's Inspectorate. So it'll be interesting to see, and I support that inquiry. So I'm not going to say that things went wrong. I mean, certainly, looking at it through the TV screens, it didn't look pretty, did it? I get that. But what we had was an unlawful gathering. We had certain elements of the group would appear to have hijacked the original concept, which was remembering what had happened to this lady, a horrific incident. And the police are really caught between a rock and a hard place because they're trying to enforce legislation which has been imposed by government. We're then expected to react and deal with that. And the police go in and try and remove protesters, people holding a vigil, which is unlawful. And that's really unpalatable to say that it's unlawful, but that's how things are. So I know it didn't look pretty. The issue as well that we find, especially in with the advent of social media, everybody is a policing expert or a public order expert. I don't say that flippantly, because even family members of mine or friends will say, "Blimey, that didn't look great." But when you look at somebody being removed from a protest situation, then generally you will have a number of police officers who will do that, and it's to keep the individual safe. We don't want them banging their heads on the floor and so on and so forth. So it doesn't always look great, I get that. But what I would say to the public is just try for a moment to put yourself in the shoes of my colleagues who are trying their absolute best in almost impossible situation. And everything they do in the heat of the moment, which they have a split second to decide, is this the right thing to do or not, will then be poured over for hours, days, weeks, in some cases years of their actions in that moment.
We're always told the police have operational independence in these circumstances. That's what the government and the Home Secretary and others like to say. And there were not necessarily split-second decisions, because we knew this was coming over a couple of days. Were the police not in a position to just say, you know what, we know what the letter of the law is, but these are extraordinary circumstances, we need to step back? Could they not have proceeded in that way because they had operational independence? Or are you saying actually that operational independence is not the case, because in the end we're still expected to enforce the law as made by Parliament?
I think the real challenge for policing is we police without fear or favour. We can't cherry pick what we do and what we don't like. So I understand that the Metropolitan Police, the senior command team, were talking and engaged with the organisers of the vigil, but a decision was made by policing that it was still going to be an unlawful protest, so they couldn't condone it, they couldn't support it. We will say to people, not necessarily in that situation, but we'll say, look, please don't protest, it's unlawful. But then thousands of people will pour on the streets and we'll get criticised, well, you should have arrested them all. I'm sorry, we just simply don't have the resources to do that. We have to manage with what we have and what we're presented with. So it is really difficult. And look, let's wait and see what the HMI come out and say about this. But certainly my colleagues, so the rank and file officers who were on the ground that day, were in an impossible situation. They were never going to please everybody. And let's not forget, for as many people who were saying that the police were wrong in what they did, we had the same number of people who were saying that they did the right thing. So, you can never please everybody.
Is there a problem, is there a bit of a hangover of the whole period of COVID where you've had to police large gatherings with a completely new set of rules and regulations and laws? And, people have made comparisons with the policing of, say, Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, where there were also, laws in place. And a lot of people said that was allowed to go, in a much more relaxed way. I mean, is this part of the problem, that you officers or police make a decision that goes one way and then it's almost like the pendulum has to swing back? I mean, is that something that your members are aware of all the time?
As far as protests are concerned, every protest is different, every protest. And whether it's the Black Lives Matter, the anti-vaccine, the Vigil, the policing dynamic will have to adapt and change according to what they're presented with. It's really difficult. It's not an exact science. There's public order strategies that we have to put in place. But what we have found is, as the year went on, the frustration and the pressure's been building. My real sadness, and I don't criticise the vast majority of the public for this, but my sadness is that policing have been seen as the villains of this pandemic, and they are far from it. They're just trying to do the absolute best they can, and as I've said, in the most impossible situations, often the most impossible situations. But it is sad when colleagues say to me, John, we're trying our best. We just can't win sometimes.
I want to put to you something that Mark Harper, a Conservative MP, has said, which is with regard to the COVID regulations, which are still going on. He says, if the government wants Parliament to pass a law this Thursday, making it illegal for families to celebrate Easter together, ministers should be prepared to say that these laws need to be consistently policed and enforced. It's damaging to pass laws that aren't enforced and unfair to place police officers in an impossible position. What do you make of that?
Yeah, look, I've said to ministers and I've said to politicians from all parties, any legislation must be able to be enforced proportionally and sensibly. What we've often been presented with is legislation which is near on impossible to enforce, and that then creates inconsistencies. And what you will also have, and look, this is the inconvenient truth, is that some forces, you look at the Metropolitan, who have many officers, still not enough, but other forces have very, very few officers. We can't throw thousands of police officers at a protest, for example, because we simply don't have them. If you look at recent events in Bristol, what the Chief Constable there was forced to do was press the mutual aid button, and that's calling on help and support, urgent help and support from other forces, because they simply didn't have the resources to deal with the demand. And those officers that they did have out on the street were absolutely on their knees. They were shattered because they'd been working prolonged hours, working on their rest days. So they needed to have that resilience built in. So yes, any legislation, must be reasonable and must be proportionate for us to be able to enforce it.
Well, talking of that, we've also got the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill going through Parliament. Do you look at that broadly and say, OK, that's going to be helpful, or do you worry about it?
I'll let the politicians decide on broadly what's right and proper. Let me talk, though, about certain parts of the bill, because we've been campaigning very strongly for certain elements of the bill. The bill is a massive bill. It's a really chunky bit of legislation, and I know there's some contentious bits in there for some, but within the bill, there's a proposal to increase the sentences for those who assault emergency workers from 12 months to 2 years. We've been lobbying for that. Of course, I support it. It's better protection for police drivers. We often see police drivers who are involved in emergency driving or pursuit driving are prosecuted for simply doing what they've been trained to do. That's been tightened up. We've been lobbying for that, so I support it. Also, the police covenant to give better support for policing, something we've been calling for, and special constables, so volunteer police officers, currently aren't able to join the Police Federation, which is the staff association that could represent them. That's wrong and it's perverse, and that's being fixed. So that's within the bill, and parties of all colours support that. But obviously, the bill comes as one package. So, it's right that there's going to be a debate and a discussion. I think what we've seen, I have to be really careful not to tread too much into the political sphere, because that's one thing that we do get burnt on. But one thing that we have realised is that the COVID legislation that's been brought in over the last 12 months has not been brought in as normal legislation would be. It's been pushed in urgently, and rightly so, but there hasn't been that scrutiny by the parliamentarians. That's probably why we've had legislation in some cases which has been really difficult to enforce, because it's not gone through the due process. I don't criticise government for that, because I think they were in a situation where they had to get legislation in place. But it has to be scrutinised. This bill certainly will be scrutinised.
Just going back to the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, I mean, part of it is about policing protest again. Obviously, a lot of criticism that it's going to be, far too easy for the authorities, whether that's government, police, whatever, to close down protests. Do you see it as actually a means whereby you can be a little bit more precise and tailored in your response to protests? I mean, you tell me, what do you think?
Without doubt, what we've seen over recent years is protests have evolved and they've changed. The legislation hasn't. We are quite slow in this country for our laws to change to the ever-changing landscape. So for that, I think it's a good thing for the legislation to be made fit for purpose to allow my colleagues policing to police protests in the best way that they can. That doesn't mean to say that the Police Federation or me or my colleagues want to inhibit lawful, peaceful protest. I'm a strong believer of that. But I know there's many questions that need to be answered.
Sorry to interrupt, John. What about when people jump on the top of a tube train and the tube can't run anymore, or they block a major bridge in the middle of a city, so you're paralysing? Do you feel at the moment it's hard for the police to react to that, and would this legislation help with that?
There's many situations where the type of process we see now are really difficult to police, and we then get criticised, policing gets criticised for not acting or not doing things, and things will happen like it'll bring a city to a standstill. So the protesters, I speak to many of the protesters, they will say, well, that's a good thing because we're getting our voice heard. Well, if that's what society wants and what government wants, fine, we will police around that. But that seems to be not what a government or society wants, and policing has to adapt to that. Look, policing, we are not the lawmakers. We take a step back. Of course, we will feed in our views, and that's about the proportionality, how effective we're going to be able to police this legislation, but it's not for us to decide on the legislation. That would be wholly inappropriate, but we've got to enforce it when it's brought into law.
John, I'm just thinking that there may be people listening to this who agree with a lot of what you say, but in the end will say, look, it is still that there's a discretion there still available for the police in the way they deal with some of these situations, whether it's COVID, whether it's policing of mass gatherings, demonstrations, even the Vigil on Clapham Common. And in the end, it is your responsibility and the police forces to decide how to do it. And you still should have that operational independence. And have you been getting it wrong some of the way along the year?
On independence and using discretion, we use discretion every single day. Thousands of times we will use discretion, and that's at a local level, whether with an individual officer dealing with a person on the street, or whether it's about protests. And what we don't see in the media is, and I understand, I make no criticism of this, but what we don't see is the hundreds of protests that have taken place which have been unremarkable. They've been policed on a very light touch. Of course, you could argue that they're unlawful in the current climate, but when local forces have been faced with a certain situation, they've done the best they can. They haven't made the headlines. Do I say that we always get it right? No, I've said in this chat before. No, we don't always get it right. Policing's really tough, and things are going to go wrong sometimes. But I don't think that's the majority of the time. And people listening to this might say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But I genuinely believe it. I don't think we get it wrong all the time. It's sometimes portrayed that we do, but I don't think that's the case.
Okay, not too much time left, so I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions. Police and crime commissioners, we've had them for about 10 years. Do you think they're helping? Do you think they're part of the solution? What do you think?
Well, certainly when the concept of police and crime commissioners was brought in, the Police Federation and I were opposed to that, and it's because it was bringing politics into policing. We are independent of politics, and to have a party political element to policing, I think was always going to be a concern. Police and crime commissioners are here to stay now, so we have to work with them. And I've met some brilliant police and crime commissioners, party political ones, independent ones, who are doing some really, really good things. What we've got to be careful of, and I know there's a review into police and crime commissioners and certainly the governance around them, we've got to make sure that the police and crime panel, who in effect oversee police and crime commissioners, we've got to make sure that they're effective and they have the teeth that they need to hold police and crime commissioners to account. I don't think that's always been the case. But do I think there's some police and crime commissioners out there doing brilliant work? Absolutely there are. We've got the elections coming up. What we don't want to see is policing being we are a political football. We're more political now than we've ever been. But on the run up to an election, that gets a little bit more heightened. We've got to not allow that to happen, because that can play into the hands of those who want to do us harm.
I just noticed you feel you're more in policing. You're more of a political football than you've ever been before.
Absolutely. I mean, people have said to me, John, why do you talk about politics? I said, because policing is more political than it's ever been before. Of course it is. And look, that's just the way that we are. The Chief Constable is operationally independent. But of course, the politics plays a great part in that. And the current government, with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, Priti Patel as the Home Secretary, they are more hands-on with policing than we've had certainly under the David Cameron and Theresa May government. And actually, in part, that's a good thing, because I want the government to be connected with policing. But there's got to be that fine line. Sometimes it gets blurred. Okay,
final question. I've asked this to people in the NHS. Is there anything that's come out of this year of COVID which actually you said, you know what, that's good, we can keep that. Is there anything you can think of in policing where you could say that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things. Certainly at a basic local level, I think the way we work, using technology better has worked really well. I think in this past 12 months we've worked more closely with other agencies, more effectively and closer than ever before. I think that I really hope that continues. And I think we've reacted and responded well to the crisis that we've been in. What we've got to do going forward, and this is all of society, whether it's policing, NHS, we've got to take the good bits. I know that sounds bizarre talking about a pandemic. We've got to take the good bits of the way that we've worked in this crisis and keep them and maintain them and build on them. And hopefully, whatever our new normal is going forward, we can bolt on the good bits that we've learned from the horrible situation that we've had to endure.
John Apter from the Police Federation, thanks very much, and wish you and your colleagues well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
John Apter from the Police Federation, speaking for his colleagues who, in his words, feel damned if they do and damned if they don't. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for another podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.